Welcome, everyone, to tonight's talk called Haunted Lighthouses of New England with author and historian Jeremy d'Entremont. I'm sure you'll enjoy this spooky topic, great for Halloween. I'm a big fan of all things spooky, and I thank the Friends of the Milton Public Library for their support of my programs. And also, I've muted you all as you come into the call, but you do have the ability to unmute yourself. Um, However, if you could save your questions for the end, that would be helpful. And hold on one sec here. You can just put them in the chat box and I'll pose them to him at the end of his presentation. So let me tell you about Jeremy. Our speaker is the former president of the American Lighthouse Foundation and the author of more than 20 books and hundreds of articles on lighthouses and maritime history. He's also the producer and host of the U.S. Lighthouse Society's podcast called Lighthearted. Jeremy has appeared on the popular Ghost Hunters TV show, as well as a program called Haunted Lighthouses of America on the Travel Channel. Please join me in a warm welcome from Mr. d'Entremont this evening.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So I'm going to go into screen sharing right away here. Okay. Make sure I have the proper boxes checked here. And I'm going into screen sharing. So, Jean, can you confirm that you are seeing my screen at this point?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good.
To spotlight you as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, I'll mention as in my introduction here that I am from Massachusetts. As you said, I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire now, but I'm from Lynn, Mass. So it's kind of the other side of the world, the other side of other side of Boston from where you are. But you were just talking about Salem. Of course, I grew up near Salem. When I was growing up, Salem was not the Halloween capital of the world. It's changed so much. It's just amazing. You don't want to go near Salem in October if you don't like crowds. But anyway, so I just want to say a little general stuff about lighthouses. First of all, I've been doing lighthouse stuff of one kind or another for about 40 years now, and for me, I started photographing them, fell in love with how beautiful they are, but then I found out how interesting the human history is of lighthouses, and that's really kept me hooked. The traditional job of lighthouse keeper is pretty much in the past now because we have about 800 lighthouses in this country, and more than half of them are still active aids to navigation, but they're all automated now. So there's really no more traditional lighthouse keepers. That's kind of fading into the past. So I try to keep the stories of keepers and families at these lighthouses alive as much as I can. Of course, this lecture focuses more on the paranormal type stories at these places, but I also do more general lectures about lighthouse keeping. There's so many aspects to it. So I'm going to do a little bit more of an introduction here and talk about kind of what I like to call the dark side of lighthouses. First of all, it's no secret that wherever you go, people love lighthouses. I think they have very wide appeal, and they're probably the most commonly used positive symbol or icon in our culture. Churches use them, schools, all kinds of businesses as a very positive symbol for hope and guidance and resilience and all these positive things. But with that said, lighthouses often seem to have what I would call a dark side, pun intended. There's something about a light out in the distance that kind of sparks our imagination. You see the lighthouse at night, see that flash out in the ocean. And for me, anyway, it sparks my imagination. It makes me think of what it was like to live at a place like that through all kinds of conditions. And whether you believe in these ghost stories or not, it had to be a scary way of life a lot of the time, especially in the winter, especially the really isolated lighthouses. Some of the stories I'm going to tell and some of these stories that have been passed down, I know can be chalked up to imagination. Again, living at a place like that, an offshore lighthouse, maybe a cast iron lighthouse out in the way out in the ocean, could lend itself to imagining things. You might hear weird sounds. The wind and storms might make strange sounds. If it's cast iron in particular, sometimes it'll settle and creak in the winter and make strange sounds. Animals can also make interesting sounds. Seals, sea lions, various birds can make kind of spooky sounds. So definitely imagination can play a role, but also exaggeration. Again, there are families living in a lot of these places, and these families, might go home they wouldn't be on the lighthouse 100% of the time. They'd go to shore. They might share a story of something weird that happened, and that would be passed along. You know how stories, when they get passed from person to person, after a while, it's like they bear very little resemblance to how it actually started, and things tend to get exaggerated. I have no doubt about that. But I will say that I know a lot of people have had very vivid experiences. I have had experiences that I'm going to talk about tonight. My wife had a very vivid ghost experience when she was young. So I like to think that I'm not crazy, and my wife and other friends I have, I think, are not crazy. So I really believe there's something real to this. What it is, I'm not 100% sure, but I know there's something real going on. So I like to call myself an open-minded skeptic. I don't believe every story I hear, but I know there's something to it. The dark side of lighthouses is something that has appealed to many writers and filmmakers over the years. Here's some book covers. In the upper left, you see the Classics Illustrated version of The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury. It's not a ghost story, but it's about a sea monster that destroys a lighthouse in part of it. It was made into the movie The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. I love the scene where the monster attacks the lighthouse. It was really, really well done for its time. But you see some of these other book covers. Storm of the Century by Stephen King featured a lighthouse. It was also a TV mini series. And these are just some examples. There's really many more. I'm sure you probably all recall movies you've seen that use lighthouses in various scary kinds of ways. The movie The Fog, for instance, took place at a lighthouse in California. And it's not that well known, but Edgar Allan Poe, who, sorry, I'm just going to click on OK, meeting being recorded because I want to get that out of the way. So it's not well known, but Edgar Allan Poe was writing a book or a story, I should say, a story on a lighthouse keeper, about a lighthouse keeper when Poe died. I believe he was 40 years old when he died. He left behind fragmentary notes for this story. And he never finished it, and so we'll never know exactly what he had in mind. The words I have on the screen here are part of the notes he left behind. An editor named Christopher Conlon, you see the book cover there, he enlisted the help of science fiction writers and horror writers from around the country, and he had them basically finish Poe's story to write their own version of what they thought, excuse me, might happen next. Based on what Poe wrote. So it's a very interesting book. It's out of print now, but you can probably find a copy. And Poe was writing about a lighthouse keeper off the coast of England in the late 1700s who wanted to be isolated. That's why he got the job. But strange things start happening, and he starts to wonder if he's going crazy or they're really happening, that kind of thing. But again, we don't know exactly what was going to happen next. But it's interesting to speculate. So I'm going to move along to some specific stories here now. I'm going to start with Boston Light. Excuse me while I clear my throat here. Excuse me. So Boston Light, of course, I decided to start here since it's pretty close to where you are. It is the first light station on the North American continent. Started in 1716. Boston was an important port by the early 1700s, so the merchants kind of clamored for a lighthouse. The colonial legislature passed a bill, and the lighthouse was established in the outer harbor in September 1716, a stone lighthouse on Little Brewster Island, about a 50-foot stone lighthouse at first. And the first keeper hired was George Worthylake, a local 43-year-old man, moved to the island with his wife and two daughters, a family servant, and two slaves, a male slave named Shadwell and a female slave named Dinah. And they paid him next to nothing. He had to do extra things like serve as a harbor pilot to make extra money. And sadly, our lighthouse history in this country got off to a really bad start because, excuse me, in November of 1718, Worthylake went to Boston with his wife and one of their two daughters on a Sunday. They attended church and stayed overnight. He picked up his pay the next morning, and they were traveling back to Boston Light in a sloop, probably similar to what you see here. They picked up a family friend at one of the other islands. They anchored off of Boston Light. No storm or anything like that going on, but Shadwell, the male slave, paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party, and they all crowded into the canoe, 6 people. As he was paddling the canoe back to the island, for whatever reason, probably it was just overcrowded, the canoe capsized, and all 6 of those people drowned. And this is still regarded as one of the worst lighthouse tragedies in American history. This is the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthylake in the Copp's Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End. There's a lot of interesting footnotes. I won't get too deeply into it, but one is that the next keeper, Robert Saunders, who went out to replace Worthylake, also drowned a few days later. So people started to wonder if the island was cursed. He was with a couple of friends, and their boat capsized, and 2 of the 3 drowned. And another interesting thing is that Benjamin Franklin, 12 years old at the time, wrote a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy, and his brother printed copies, and he sold copies of The Lighthouse Tragedy in the streets of Boston. Jumping ahead, this is a picture from the late 1800s, but I want to tell you something that happened in the late 1940s. There was a woman named Maisie Anderson. Her husband was a Coast Guard lightkeeper at Boston Light. I should mention that before 1939, lighthouse keepers were civilian employees of the federal government. Or if you go back far enough, they worked for the colonial governments. But for a long time, they were civilian employees of the federal government. And then in 1939, the Coast Guard took over management of lighthouses. So this woman named Maisie Anderson was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper and had lived at lighthouses in Maine. And then she married a Coast Guard lighthouse keeper, and they lived at Boston Light in the late 1940s for a couple of years. Later, she wrote an article for Yankee Magazine about her life at lighthouses, and she said that on multiple occasions she would she'd be in bed in the keeper's house, and she would hear a girl sobbing outside. And she said that at least once, I'm not sure if it was more than once, but that she heard the girl sobbing and calling out, "Shadwell, Shadwell." And she had no idea what that meant. It wasn't until later that Maisie was doing some research on the history of Boston Light, and she discovered that the slave who was paddling the canoe when it capsized, that his name was Shadwell. So that's what she had heard the girl calling out. So she kind of speculated that she was hearing like a replay of that incident, which is one form of haunting that people talk about. That she thought she was hearing the little girl calling out for Shadwell the slave. And also, Maisie said that she would hear what she called a man's maniacal laughter coming out of the boathouse. I have no idea what that was all about. I don't know of anybody else who's heard that, but that's something she mentioned in the Yankee article as well. Jumping ahead to the late 1980s, this is Dennis Dever. I was giving tours of Boston Light in the late 80s. I lived in Winthrop, Mass. At the time, and got quite involved helping friends of the Boston Harbor Islands to give tours out there. So I got to know Dennis Dever, who was the Coast Guard officer in charge out there at that time. He's standing next to the beautiful old second order Fresnel lens, meaning second to the largest kind of lens that was made. Beautiful rotating glass lens. It's still out there. So Dennis was quite a guy. He loved being a lighthouse keeper. I interviewed him in the lighthouse in the summer of '89. I'm going to play you a brief clip of that right now.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window. Just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
So again, Dennis loved being a lighthouse keeper. He loved a good storm out there, and he also loved a good ghost story. And he told me that a number of odd things happened out there to him, and heard things like this from other Coast Guard keepers too in that era. He said that one day he was at the kitchen window looking over towards the lighthouse. He was doing the dishes or something like that. And he saw a man standing in the lantern room, the top of the lighthouse. He looked in the next room, and the only other Coast Guard guy who was out there at the time was right there in the next room. So Dennis started hurrying over to the lighthouse, and he said that it looked like a man in an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform. He rushed up the stairs, and of course, there was nobody there. which was pretty odd. And the Coast Guard keepers would talk about tools disappearing and things like that, things moving around when, they knew that they had left it a certain way, that sort of thing. Dennis also said that when he would be doing work in the boathouse, he would have the radio on, a rock station, and he said that the radio would change itself to a classical station, and he would turn it back, and he had like a running battle with the radio. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Oh, here's the boathouse that he was talking about right there. And it looked like Dennis was going to be the last lighthouse keeper in the country, but then in October '89, legislation was passed to keep a presence out there. So the Coast Guard kept keepers out there for a number of years. It was the only staff light station after 1990. But then about 20 years ago, they hired a civilian keeper. Here's an aerial picture showing the keeper's house. This is what it looks like today. So again, about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago now, they hired a civilian keeper, Sally Snowman, and she just retired at the end of this past year as the last official lighthouse keeper in the United States. And her job was more about supervising tours and things like that, but still an important job. Civilian employee of the Coast Guard, first woman keeper in the history of Boston Light. And I've known Sally for a very long time. She's an interesting person. She's kind of new agey in a way, that kind of thing. And she feels very strongly that there are spirits at Boston Light, spirits of the past. She doesn't call them ghosts, but she feels they're very much there. And she told me that some of the Coast Guard auxiliary watchstanders who spend time out there have had experiences, like one who was sleeping on a couch in the living room one night in the keeper's house, and it was pouring rain out, and there were problems with leaks in the cellar. So this person was getting up occasionally and checking for the leaks to make sure things weren't flooded. And one of the times they got up, and there's a stairway to the second floor right near that couch. And as this person got up, they saw a woman coming down the stairs. Their eyes locked for a second, and then she disappeared. So that was a little disconcerting. I'll tell you that a few years ago, Sally invited me, and I spent a night on that couch out there. And I was aware of those stairs, but I didn't see anything weird. The gulls kept me awake all night, though. That was the spookiest thing that I experienced, was the loud gulls make a racket. So I don't always talk about Minus Light in this lecture, but I decided to tonight because it's not too far from your part of the world. It's down off Cohasset and Scituate. It's a incredible lighthouse. It's 114-foot granite towers. You can see that's actually the base is actually submerged at high tide. You can see a little bit of the rocks around it at low tide, but it's really an incredible lighthouse. One of the best known so-called wave-swept or sea-swept lighthouses in the country. And here's the first lighthouse built there in 1851, a spindly tower on pilings that were drilled down into the rock, 70 feet tall. And the keepers lived in the upper part of this structure. And in April of 1851, there was a tremendous storm, April 16th, and there were two young assistant keepers in charge. The head keeper was away on shore. These two young assistant keepers were in their 20s. One was from Portugal, one was from England. And in the wee hours of the morning, the tower actually fell over. And sadly, the two keepers died. One of them was found on an island nearby. The other one was found on a beach at Cohasset. And it's one of the most famous lighthouse tragedies in history. That's the sad part of the story. The happy part of the story is that they built the new tower. It took 5 years to build, and it's a great achievement in lighthouse building. But interestingly, there are ghost stories out there. One of the most common things you hear is that people, fishermen and other people in boats out around the lighthouse, especially if there's a storm coming in, will see a figure on the ladder that goes up to the doorway on the side of the lighthouse. And they say that person looks like they're waving them away, like, stay away, and actually shouting, stay away, but in Portuguese. And again, one of those young keepers who died was Portuguese. Another story, some of you, I'm sure, remember Edward Rowe Snow, the very popular historian who died in 1982. But in some of his books, he wrote about a story here. There was a keeper, this was, I believe, in the 1940s, who was, there were two keepers in the lighthouse at that time. They used to rotate. They'd assign like 3 men to it. 2 would be on there at a time, and 1 would be on shore leave. So there was one of the 2 guys out there was sitting at a desk, and he tapped his pipe. He was smoking a pipe and he tapped his pipe on the table and tapped it like 3 times. And suddenly there was a tap, tap, tap on a stovepipe. There was a stovepipe running between floors for heat. And he thought it was the other keeper signaling to him. So he yelled, what do you want? The other keeper came in and said, I didn't do anything. What are you talking about? So they discussed what had happened, and he was sure he had heard 3 taps on that pipe. And then they found out that the original keepers, before the first lighthouse fell over, that they would communicate that way by tapping on a pipe between floors. So they speculated that maybe they were hearing one of those keepers who died in 1851. So I'm going to move along here. I'm going to jump down to southern New England. This is, I think, is one of the most interesting lighthouses anywhere. New London Ledge Light, built in 1909. It's between Groton and New London, Connecticut. Very beautiful brick building, as you can see on a pier there. The first time I saw it, I thought that can't be a lighthouse. That looks so crazy, but it's one of a kind. So keepers and families lived out there for quite a few years until the later Coast Guard keepers lived out there until the late 1980s. And here's an early postcard of it. So this has probably the most famous ghost story of any New England lighthouse. And I'm going to tell you the story as it's usually told. And it's important to start this by saying they say. I'm not sure who they are, but this is a story that's been written about and talked about in a lot of places. So they say that in the 1930s, there was a keeper named Ernie, lived there with his wife. And they say that one day Ernie, well, I should mention that his wife became very bored. She didn't like living there. So one day Ernie went away to get supplies. He came back. And when he got back, his wife was gone. She had left a note saying that she had run away with the captain of the Block Island ferry that goes by there a couple of times a day. So they say that poor Ernie was distraught. He went to the roof of the lighthouse and dove off to his death. Some versions say that he drank himself stupid and fell off the roof to his death. But in any case, he died, and they say that he left a note behind saying he would haunt the place forevermore because of what was done to him. And they say that people have had a lot of odd experiences out there. The Coast Guard keepers would say that furniture would rearrange itself. And supposedly, one thing I read is that only women would actually see Ernie the ghost, and they would only see him in mirrors. The Coast Guard keepers also said the light would turn off by itself, the foghorn would turn on and off. And on and on. So, I wasn't there. I can't verify any of those things, but there were certainly a lot of stories. And a number of the paranormal TV shows have gone there over the years. I got to go out in July of 2006 with a group called New England Ghost Project for a TV show called American Builder, which used to be on Comcast Cable on their own channel. It was a daily show. Maybe some of you know I think his name is Brian Gorey, I believe. He's on window commercials these days, but he used to be the host of this show. And they decided to do a Halloween special about this haunted lighthouse. So a group of us went out, and you see in the picture on the left, the young guy in the maroon baseball cap was one of the hosts of American Builder. So he was out there with us along with a camera crew. Guy on the right, who you don't see too well here, but that's Ron Kolek. He's from Dracut, Mass, and he is the founder of New England Ghost Project, and he's written books on the paranormal, has a radio show. The woman with the curly hair you see in both pictures is Maureen Wood, a psychic medium, and the theory is that she actually goes into a trance and you can believe whatever you want to believe about it, but it appears that spirits speak through her. I know her pretty well. I know she's sincere, and I know there's something interesting going on there. Exactly what it is, I'm not 100% sure. But the other woman is Karen Mossy, who is an expert on EVPs, and I'm going to explain what that is in a couple of minutes. Anyway, so early that evening, they tried the Ouija board that you see there, and Ron, some people think those are dangerous or evil or something. Ron Kolek's feeling is that it's just another tool you can use to try to contact spirits. He doesn't think they're especially dangerous. Anyway, not too much happened with that. So the group then was sitting around on the floor. I was watching. I wasn't part of the group sitting on the floor, but they were holding hands. And suddenly Maureen Wood did what she does, where she seemed to go into like a trance. Her eyes were closed, her head was down, and she said, "There's someone here." And then suddenly her demeanor changed. She started speaking like in a deeper voice, and she turned towards Ron and she said, "You lie, you lie. Please leave." And then she started, well, first she was squeezing the hands of, I think, Ron and the young guy there from American Builder. Later, the I can't think of his name, but the young guy there said that Maureen was squeezing his hand so hard it was really hurting him, and he's like a big football player kind of guy. So Maureen said, "Please leave," and then she started holding her head, and she said, "Oh, my head," and I just realized I actually have the clip of this. I'm giving it all away, but I'm going to play you the clip of what I was just saying. This is actually a short video clip from the show. And you'll notice right at the beginning, as the thing's starting to happen, there were some TV monitors in the next room, and they all kind of went crazy right at the moment Maureen said somebody is here. So forget everything I just said, and I'm going to play this clip, which kind of goes over some of the same things.
Are you trying to tell us something? You and G just keeps coming up.
Sorry, the sound is a little soft. You might have to turn up your volume.
Hearing you go in my head.
Do you want us to leave? That would be a big yes.
Well, we have no way to get out of here, so we have to stay. Who are you?
It's almost getting like a warning though.
A warning?
Yeah, like yeah, there's something upstairs.
Oh,
Who is here with us?
is there anyone with us
Yeah,
now? Why are we here?
yeah.
Do you like us here?
You're interfering. Please leave. Please leave. Now.
You know you were dead. It's time for you to go.
Someone else here.
Someone else here?
Angry.
Someone's angry. Oh, we got a new visitor. Who is here with us now?
You lie. You lie. You lie. So angry. He left me
Where?
outside. Top of
Are you on the roof of the lighthouse?
the...
Are you on the roof?
Let me down. Let me down.
They left you up on the roof of the lighthouse?
You all right?
She's fine. Maureen? No. Push him out. Push him out, Maureen. Maureen, push him out. Push him out, Maureen. Cut the film. Cut the film.
Okay, so I hope you could hear that. I apologize. The sound was kind of soft. Hope you're able to turn up your volume because I had it as far up as I could go. But anyway, so it was pretty interesting being there that night. I kind of felt like I was in the middle of an Exorcist movie or something. But again, I know Maureen pretty well, and you saw that look she gave Ron at one point, like when she looks like that, I kind of feel like, well, Maureen's not home. Somebody else is there. So this picture is from early the next morning. We stayed the whole night out there. We tried to sleep around 5 a.m. for a while, but there was no beds or anything. I laid down on one of the floors in one of the rooms, and then as it started to get light, I realized there were spiders all over the wall. So that was pretty scary too. But anyway, so we're waiting to be picked up, waiting for the boat. Maureen said that what she got from her experience there was that she felt there's a very angry male spirit there. And she says that this was not a lighthouse keeper. She said he was a construction worker and that he was locked out by his coworkers as a prank, locked out on the roof outside, and was struggling to get back in and slipped and fell to his death. And she said he's very angry and angry at what was done to him, and also angry because everybody has the story wrong. Everybody thinks it was a lighthouse keeper. So is this true? I have no idea. There's no way to know. But there's no record of a keeper named Ernie. There's no record of any of that happening. I don't think it happened. I think it's a legend. Maureen's story of a construction worker dying is actually more believable to me. So we'll never prove it, I don't think, but it's an interesting story, interesting alternative story. So that night, Karen Mossy, I mentioned, was an EVP expert. That's electronic voice phenomena. The idea is, if you watch the paranormal TV shows, you've heard about this. The idea is that they'll use a recorder, a digital recorder. Of course, it used to be tape, but a person will often ask questions in the recorder, like, "Are you here?" Nothing, if it's a true EVP, nothing is heard audibly at the time, but later when it's played back, you might hear a voice. So here's Karen Mossy asking, "Are you here? Yes or no?" And she gets an answer.
Are you
Hope you could hear that okay. Kind of sounds like a fuzzy yes. All right, and I'll play you another one. This is recorded, I think it was about 2 a.m., and Karen was out near the stairs, you see on the side of the pier there. And you're not going to hear her voice, but she feels that this whispery kind of voice is saying, "Help me, I'm cold." So here it is. So there's different classes of EVPs, A being one that where everybody hears the same thing and there's no doubt about it, down to D being pretty indistinct and people can kind of interpret, what they think it's saying. This one I would say is about a B or C, but it, does sound like "Help me, I'm cold," I think. We don't know the explanation for that. There's also legends about sailboat being wrecked there and a whole family dying, but there's no proof of any of that. So I don't know, but this place certainly has its legends. And there's Ernie, the ghost, who's been placed there. The New London Maritime Society now owns the lighthouse and runs stores there, and they have Ernie sitting by one of the windows, as you can see. So moving on, this is another Southern New England lighthouse, Rose Island in Newport, Rhode Island. Beautiful building, as you can see. And they have overnight stays for the public, the Rose Island Lighthouse Foundation. The building in front of you see how the lighthouse is built onto the keeper's house, and in front of that is an old fog signal building, and that's actually has a room inside with a bed and everything, where they have overnight stays there. I spent a night there one time. And this is an older picture. I should get a new picture. That is the way the lantern room used to look. But the reason I have this here is that somebody emailed this to me and they thought they captured something very interesting. You see the lower part of the picture, kind of near the center. There's a big area there. It's hard to tell what you're looking at, but they said it doesn't look like a reflection. They said it was not a reflection. It's not a shadow of anybody. It looks almost like an indistinct form. I don't know if you can all see what I mean, but really interesting picture, and I don't know the explanation for it. But I went out there with New England Ghost Project again. Here's some of the group and the doc. There's Ron Kolek towards the left there. This was just about 10 years ago now. And it was a night of a super moon, big red or orange moon rose up, and so it was very bright for night. I took this picture of the lighthouse late at night, and it was a very interesting night there. There's a museum on the first floor of the keeper's house, and upstairs is a finished apartment where you can stay overnight. So this is part of the museum downstairs. You don't see it in this picture, but there was a little table we tried something with. Ron was talking about table tipping, which is something that goes back to like the 19th century when they would have seances and stuff. People put their fingertips on a table, and it sometimes will move apparently on its own. So there was, again, a small table there, and Ron and Dave McCurdy, who at the time was the director of the Lighthouse Foundation, the three of us put our fingertips on this little table. It was almost pitch dark, but I could see that only our fingertips were touching it, nothing else, not our legs or anything. And Ron said, "If there are any spirits here, please let us know you're here by moving this table. As long as you mean us no harm," he said. So after just a couple of minutes, it felt like it was vibrating a little bit. And then after a few more minutes, the table was sort of jumping around. And it actually started almost like it was walking around in a circle. And at one point, it pressed up against my chest. I was a little nervous. It didn't hurt me, but I remember I said at the time, "Please don't hurt me. Ron will not let me live that down." But anyway, so that was extremely interesting. But then it got even more interesting because later that night, a group of us went upstairs, and there were about, I think, 6 people. And it's a little hard to see. I'm going to play you a video here. There was a big, heavy, like oak kitchen table or dining room table up there. And we tried table tipping again. We thought, well, it's probably not going to work with this huge table, but we all put our fingertips on it. And there was a camera, as you can see, recording this. And amazingly, the same thing happened again. First, a fine vibration, and then the table started dancing around, this huge table. So this is towards the end where the table is really moving a lot. Let me play this clip for you.
By the way, look at it. Rocket. Let's see if we can do it. Let's do it.
Can you lift it up? Can you make it actually go off the floor?
It's almost
just
at the
like
end
an
of
inch.
it. Keep rocking it, rock it. Yeah. Rocket. Let's see
I
if we can
kept
do it.
checking to make
Let's
sure
do it.
nobody's legs were touching
Those meters have moved.
it.
Oh, yeah, the table rock, because the table's rocking.
People's fingers were barely touching it. And it seemed like the more we were yelling and laughing and acting, like the more we did that, the more it was
Man, this is amazing. All right, we're going. You gonna do it? Come on, we're getting faster. Come on.
Cough energy.
Get the momentum going.
Use our energy. We give it freely as long as we know how. Just one more big push.
I see that some of us aren't even really touching it.
I'm like, oh,
Yeah, some people are touching it with 2 fingers.
My hands go with it though because I'm freaking tall.
Whoops, sorry. I think there might be a little bit that's R-rated here. I should bleep it out.
all right.
Let me go over there and hurt you.
Come on, let's get
Maybe quick.
one leg off. Come on, let's go harder. We can do it.
So,
Come on,
the
we're
end
all a
here,
team. Okay, we don't need the cable arm noises. Go for it, Mr. Curly. Lift it. Oh my God, it came up.
that was pretty interesting. It's the kind of thing where I wouldn't believe it if I wasn't there. And I still am amazed thinking back to that night. So again, I kept checking. Nobody was touching that except with their fingertips. And at the end, we checked the table, and the joints in the table were loose. And they had been really tight. And later we checked it again, and it was like it had tightened up again. So as we're doing that, it's like the whole table, the legs and everything kind of loose, the joints all loosened up. So moving up to Borden Flats Light, this is in Fall River, Massachusetts. It's at the mouth of the Taunton River, and you see the, I believe it's called the Braga Bridge there. At the mouth of the river, and this is a type of lighthouse people sometimes call a spark plug type light. It's like a caisson, cast iron caisson sunk down into the bottom, and then the lighthouse built on top of that. And the keepers lived inside this type of lighthouse. No keeper's house; they actually lived in the tower. And this is my friend Nick Korstad, who bought that lighthouse at auction from the government about 15 years ago now, and restored it and actually turned it into a place with overnight stays. It's now owned by another man who still has the overnight stays out there. Nick owns a Lighthouse B&B in Michigan now, but he really worked wonders on this place. And this is keeper John Paul, who was there for a number of years in the early 1900s, here with his 3 sons. And I'm showing you him for a reason. Whoops. I thought I had one more picture of Borden Flats. But anyway, a group of us from New England Ghost Project went out there about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a very interesting night. I'll just tell you one thing that happened, and that was we had a different psychic medium who works a lot with New England Ghost Project. Her name is Leslie Marden. She's actually written a book, her life story, that's called Medium Rare. I love the title. But she and another woman who considered herself somewhat sensitive were out there that night. And I know that neither of them had any idea about the place going into it. In fact, Ron would just bring her places and not tell her anything in advance. So she didn't even know where she was going that night. Leslie and this other woman were both given pieces of paper, and we asked if you could draw whatever comes into your mind. They both draw a man's face with a mustache and a hat on, and it looked somewhat like the guy you see here, John Paul. And Nick Korstad had a number of experiences out there, and he felt strongly that the spirit of a keeper was out there. So there were a number of interesting happenings that night, but I'm going to save those maybe for part 2. I'm going to move on here. I'm going to jump up to northern New England to Owl's Head Light in Midcoast, Maine. It's near Rockland, Maine. And beautiful place, as you can see. It's beautiful on land, but it's also very beautiful from the water. established in 1825, rebuilt in 1852, just a little brick lighthouse, but the light's 100 feet above the water there, the entrance to Rockland Harbor on Penobscot Bay. And a lot of the ghost stories here seem to point to a keeper of the past being out there. This particular keeper is George Woodward. He was there in the 40s. I'm not saying he haunts the place. I'm just showing him as an example. I was there in 1988. That's, believe it or not, that's in the left picture. That's me on the left there in 1988. And I'm with Mac Rouse, Malcolm or Mac Rouse, who was the last Coast Guard keeper at this lighthouse. It was being automated at the time I was there. And Mac told me, we talked about a lot of things, and he said, well, the place is haunted, right? In his thick Maine accent. And he said that his wife saw somebody in the window when there was really nobody there. And he said that their son repeatedly would insist that there was a woman sitting in a chair in the kitchen, although there was nobody there. And he really thought there was something going on there. One of the stories you hear, supposedly, that's happened to a lot of people there, is that they'll go out in the morning and you see the walkway in back of us there. That leads up to a stairway that goes up to the lighthouse. And they say that at times if there's snow on the walkway, they'll see footprints in the snow not going across the yards. Like they just start on the walkway, go up the stairs, and then end at the door to the lighthouse, which does not make a whole lot of sense. So that's a common story there. So later on, I met a guy named John Norton. He had been keeper there about 1980, Coast Guard keeper, and he told me that, and he was a very kind of gruff guy. He wouldn't make something like this up. He said that one day he was lying on the bed in the upstairs, one of the upstairs bedrooms, and he said he knew beyond any shadow of a doubt he was wide awake. He was not asleep, and he said the face of an old man appeared above him, was looking at him, and then disappeared. Soon after him, the next keeper was Andy German, Germann. Andy and his wife Denise lived there for a couple of years, and they had some experiences. And the most interesting one was one night they were in bed, but then Andy realized he had to do something outside, so he went outside, left Denise alone. She thought he came back. She said, how to go outside, and then she realized he wasn't there. But she said that it was like it was the indentation of somebody moving around on the bed next door, which is kind of creepy. And later, Andy told her that when he had left the room, he saw what he described as a gray phosphorescent figure or smoky kind of figure move right through him and through the wall into the bedroom. I don't know why he didn't tell his wife at the time, but that seemed to kind of coincide with what she experienced. And then the next family was the ones you see here on the right. That's Gerard Graham and his wife Debbie and their little daughter Claire. They're by the beautiful Fresnel lens in that lighthouse. And when they came, the Germans told them that the place is haunted. They said especially that one bedroom upstairs. So you probably don't want to use that room. But the Grahams laughed. They thought that was a riot. So they made that one room their daughter Claire's bedroom, their 3-year-old daughter. And the whole time they lived there, Claire had an imaginary friend that she described as an old sea captain. One night about 11 o'clock, Debbie and Gerard were asleep, and Claire, again, 3 years old at the time, came in, woke them up, and said, "Fog's coming in, time to put the horn on." And they had no idea where she got that. They had never talked about anything like that in front of her, so they figured the old sea captain told her. Years later, I got an email from Debbie Graham. She told me about life there, and at the end she said, "And the place is haunted, right?" So in 2001, I was contacted by the Travel Channel. Gene mentioned it in the introduction, and they were doing a documentary on haunted lighthouses of America. So I helped out, and I actually pointed them towards Owl's Head Light. They flew Debbie Graham up from Florida to be in it. The guy in this picture at Owl's Head is the father-in-law of a Coast Guard officer who was living in the keeper's house at that time. Not a keeper, but he was the commanding officer of a local Coast Guard vessel. So this family was living there, and the father-in-law they had him put on the uniform as if he was the lighthouse ghost walking up the stairs there. So it was pretty fun being part of that. I actually got to play the lighthouse ghost myself at another lighthouse near there, Prospect Harbor. They put the uniform on me, and you see my shadow going up the wall. So I'm the only one who knows that's me when I see it. And this picture was emailed to me several years ago by Bob D'Amato, who lives in Connecticut. He had visited Owl's Head Light with a friend. This picture was taken about 11 o'clock at night from the top of the stairs in front of the lighthouse, looking down towards the water. You see the little brick oil house where the keepers stored kerosene. Excuse me. And you see the flagpole there. The interesting thing is to the right of the flagpole, and I'm going to show you what it looks like when you zoom in on that. Here it is. He could not believe it when he saw this, when he realized what he got here. He said that his friend was behind him when he took the picture. There was nobody else there. It was an exposure of a few seconds. You could see when you see the flagpole blurred, the flag blurred. So if somebody else was in the picture, which there was not, they would be blurred. And the edges of this are pretty distinct, but it's like you can see right through this figure. It sure looks like a figure standing there. I have had dinner with Bob D'Amato and his father and talked to him quite a bit. I'm convinced he didn't Photoshop this or, fake it in any way. So it's a pretty interesting picture, and I don't have a full explanation for it. I'm going to move along. Seguin Light is in Midcoast, Maine at the mouth of the Kennebec River. It's got another very famous ghost story. It's the highest light above sea level in the state of Maine, about 200 feet up above the water. It's got a first order, the biggest kind of lens that they made, still in use there. It's got a very famous ghost story. Here's another picture showing how high it is above the water. They say that in the mid 1800s, there was a keeper there with his living with his wife. The wife became very bored. It's a common theme. And the keeper bought his wife a piano. They had the piano carried up the steep path to the keeper's house. But along with the piano, the wife was only given one piece of sheet music. So she learned how to play that song, and she would play it over and over and over and over until it drove her husband crazy. They say he grabbed an axe, proceeded to chop up the piano, and killed his wife and killed himself. So they say. And they say that ever since then, if you're on the island on a quiet day or night, you will hear soft piano music floating in the breeze. Here's an early postcard of it. I don't think it's a true story because there's no record of anything like that happening, but people do hear piano music. It doesn't seem to be coming from anywhere. A woman I know from the General Services Administration, the office in Boston, I was out on a Coast Guard boat with her a number of years ago, and she told me that a week earlier she had been on Seguin Island and that she heard soft piano music. She's walking around by herself, heard this piano music, so she went to the keeper's house, and there was a caretaker, and she said that was really pretty. Who was playing the piano? And he said, well, there's no piano here, and there was no music, so you must have heard the ghost. And she was absolutely convinced she heard it, and she said it sounded like a memory, which is, I think, a pretty interesting way to describe music. I'm going to move along here to Boone Island. Just got a couple more lighthouses to tell you about. I don't want to overstay my welcome here, but this is Boone Island off of southern Maine, about 8 miles out in the ocean. Tallest lighthouse in New England, about 130 feet tall. There used to be two big keepers' houses out there that are gone, but the present owner who bought it from the government has built a small keeper's house that you see there behind the solar panels. There was a very famous shipwreck here back in 1710. The Nottingham Galley, a ship from England, was wrecked with 14 men on board. The ship was a total loss, but the 14 men all survived the wreck. But then they were basically the ones who survived were on the island for almost a month through brutal winter weather with basically no food. Two of them tried to get to shore in a makeshift raft, and they died. Two others died on the island. The ones who survived resorted to extraordinary measures. I think you get my drift. It's a very famous story. The novelist Kenneth Roberts wrote a novel about it in the 1950s, very popular. So it's really one of the most famous maritime stories in history, really. And it was largely that wreck and other wrecks that led to a lighthouse being established in 1811. Lighthouse that's there now is from 1854. Families lived out there for many years. The keeper on the far right with the white mustache, Willie Williams, lived out there for 28 years. Those are some of his grandchildren there in this picture. And these two guys were Coast Guard keepers in the early 1970s, standing by the second order Fresnel lens there that's now at a museum in Kittery. That's Bob Edwards and Bob Roberts. I spoke on the phone with Bob Roberts probably 20 years ago, and he told me when he first showed up there, The other Coast Guard keepers said to him or asked him if he believed in ghosts, and he laughed. And they said, "You're not going to be laughing for long after you live out here for a while." And he told me he did come to believe the place was haunted. He said that he always felt like somebody was watching him when we'd go out to the fog signal building at night. And he said one afternoon, he and Bob Edwards, you see them on the right there in that boat, they went out fishing, probably in that boat. And they realized they had gone too far from the island. It was late afternoon, and they had to hurry back to the island to light the light at sunset. So they're hurrying back, and as they're coming back, the light came on before they landed. They landed and looked around, and nobody was there. And they never figured out who lit the light in the lighthouse that night. I didn't think to ask them if the tower was locked. I think it probably wasn't, but anyway, they never figured that out. So White Island Light, I live again in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This is one of my local lighthouses at the southernmost of the Isles of Shoals, the group of islands off the New Hampshire seacoast. Established in 1821, got a lot of interesting history. This is Celia Thaxter, the most famous person who ever lived there. She was the daughter of the keeper. She went on to become a very famous writer and poet. And in her book, Among the Isles of Shoals, she talked about some of the ghost stories of the islands out there. Isles of Shoals have a lot of interesting legends. Here's a picture, aerial picture from a few decades ago. And the story that you often hear about White Island is that Blackbeard the pirate came through there and that he left a young bride, a teenage girl who he had married, left her on the island along with his treasure, and he told her he would return. He then went down the coast and was killed off North Carolina, so obviously he never returned. And they say that this young woman ghost, that she soon died on the island, and that her ghost seen wandering. Sometimes they say White Island, sometimes sometimes you hear some of the other islands out there. But in any case, they say that she wanders out there and saying he shall return, or he will come back, something like that. There's Blackbeard the pirate. And here's the last Coast Guard crew that was out there when they automated the light in 1986. And here is a video I'm going to play for you. This is from the blizzard of 78. I'm sure a lot of you remember the blizzard of 1978. I sure do. This film I'm going to show here was silent film. It was taken by one of the Coast Guard keepers out there from the keeper's house. And these waves are coming up 50, 60 feet above the water, above the ocean. And you see a storage building being washed away, being moved around by the waves. The boathouse was actually destroyed by this storm. One of the Coast Guard keepers told a friend who told me that this young Coast Guard keeper was out there as the storm was coming in. He was trying to secure the boathouse. And he said that the ghost of a woman in white appeared in front of him, and that she actually said something to the effect of, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." And he said that reassured him. I'm not so sure I'd be reassured by a ghost. But anyway, as it turned out, it was not that bad. But the two guys who were out there were okay. It was actually a worse situation at Boone Island, where the keepers had to be rescued by helicopter. So moving along here, this is a picture taken by Glenn Young, who was a Coast Guard keeper in the 80s, but then he became a caretaker at Star Island near there, and he took this picture from Star Island during a storm. Glenn told me that during storms when he was at White Island, he'd be in the walkway, that covered walkway between the house and the lighthouse tower, and he would hear a woman's voice. And he said it sounded like she was warning him, but he couldn't quite make out the words. And he said he knew it wasn't the wind. There was no woman on the island, and he was absolutely sure that he was hearing a woman's voice. So there are a lot of stories out there. So I got one more lighthouse to tell you about. This is my hometown lighthouse, Portsmouth Harbor Light, actually in Newcastle, about 10 minutes from my home here. Lighthouse that's there now is from 1878. The original lighthouse on this location was the first lighthouse north of Boston in the colonies, built in 1771. You got the very historic fort there. You see the wall of Fort Constitution. You see the keeper's house, what used to be the keeper's house on the other side of the wall. This is now on a Coast Guard Station Portsmouth Harbor, and the keeper's house is used for offices. This guy, Joshua Card, was the longest serving keeper of Portsmouth Harbor Light. He was a local guy. And amazingly, he was keeper until he was 86 years old. He was keeper 1874 to 1909. He was the oldest keeper in the country when he retired at 86. He had a stroke and he had to retire. And if you look at his lighthouse service uniform in this picture, it's a little hard to see, but you can see there's something on the lapels of the jacket. It was the letter K. They say he loved to show people around his lighthouse. And when he was showing people around, if they asked him, what does that K stand for? He would say, why, Captain, of course. So I think he liked being called Captain. I think he knew how to spell. And so Captain was a sign of respect for lighthouse keepers. So he definitely would have been known as Captain Card. So that I'm going to refer back to that in a couple of minutes. That's an important story there. I'm going to come back to it. Then I want to tell you about Elson and Connie Small. Elson Small came in 1946 as the Coast Guard keeper. He and his wife Connie had lived on islands off the Maine coast for 26 years before this. So they were thrilled to live somewhere where they could actually drive to their home instead of taking a boat. Also thrilled to have electricity for the first time when they moved there. So Elson retired in 1948. Connie went on to write a classic book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife. If you want to read what it was like to live at lighthouses, read The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife by Connie Small. I was lucky enough to know Connie in her late years. She lived to be 103. She died in 2005. In the picture on the right, that is me on the far right. That is in 2003, and we gave Connie a certificate as the honorary chairperson of our local group, Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse. And she's 101 in that picture. I feel very lucky to have known her. She was just a very cheerful, optimistic person, and so happy to know people were taking care of lighthouses. So, as I just mentioned, she died in early 2005 at 103. Sorry, just taking a drink of water. And a few months later that summer, well, let me back up for a second. I founded Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse in 2001. And soon after I started it, I started hearing stories from the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is on there 24 hours a day. There's always somebody there overnight. And I started hearing these stories. For one thing, I heard that they would often, from the lookout tower on top of the Coast Guard's main building, they would see a woman walking along the seawall in the middle of the night. They go out and check, and nobody was there. One of them said they were doing the rounds at midnight. They saw a man standing in front of the keeper's house. They called to them and walked towards them, but the figure disappeared. Uh, People on watch in the tower would say around 2 or 3 a.m. often they hear footsteps coming up the metal stairs in the tower, and but nobody was there. And a woman who worked in the upstairs of worked downstairs in the keeper's house told me that she would hear footsteps going back and forth on the floor above her, even though nobody was there, and she would double check. And she was a little shaken up by that. So these stories kind of piled up. And in August 2005, we called in New England Ghost Project. That's the first time I met them. And there again, you see Ron Kolick and Maureen Wood and Karen Mossy, the EVP expert. And they are there in the watch room, which is the level at the top of the stairs, but below the lantern room where the light is. So first, I'm going to play you an EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recording made by Karen Mossy. I think it was after midnight in that watch room where they're standing here. And you're going to hear Karen's voice say, "Who's there?" Followed by what appears to be an answer. So let me play it for you. I don't know how well you can hear that. It's probably not a Class A EVP. I'll play it again. Karen felt that it's saying captain. To me, it kind of sounds like the captain, like really quick, the captain. So that's why I told you the story about Joshua Card, how he liked being called captain. Is that him? Who knows? There's no way to prove that. But I will tell you that some people have heard an audible voice in the lighthouse. I'm one of those people. I was giving a tour one afternoon for a young couple. This is about, I think it was 2007. It was the middle of the afternoon. And as I'm speaking to them, I heard, hello. And it sounded like it was just around the corner at the top of the stairs. There was a wall hiding that part of the stairs from me. I looked around and there was nobody there. I asked a couple if they heard something. The guy said, yeah, I heard a man say hello. The woman didn't hear anything. And we looked all over. There was nobody around. One of our volunteers was up in the lantern room painting one day. He thought he heard something. He was listening to music with headphones, thought he heard something, took the headphones off, and he heard, "What are you doing?" And he looked everywhere. There was nobody there. So he decided to pack up the paint, go home at that point. My wife was once taking decorations down. I think that very porthole you see in this picture, she was taking down Christmas decorations. And she described it. She was facing the wall and she heard what sounded like somebody right in back of her make a noise in her ear. She said she couldn't make out a word. It was like, "Rah." And she turned around and said, "May I help you?" And nobody was there. She looked around, no sign of anybody. So again, the voices recorded in some of these EVPs sound very much like what I and these other people have heard audibly. This is a later investigation. You're going to hear Ron Kolek. He was out on the deck at the top of the lighthouse late at night, and he says, "Do you like us being here?" And he gets an answer.
You like us being here?
Sounds like a pretty distinct yes to me.
You like us being
And
here?
it's that same sort of raspy male voice. And then Jim Stonier, who's now the EVP person for New England Ghost Project. This is just like a minute after the one with Ron just now. And Jim says, "I think you should check the light." And he gets an answer.
I think you should check the light.
Sounds like okay to me. I like how there's a pause there, like maybe Joshua Card was taking a nap and this woke him up. And okay.
I think you should check the light.
Whoops.
I think you should check the light.
All right. So I'm going to play you one more EVP here, and this was recorded by a different group, Sauhegan Paranormal out of Nashua, New Hampshire. And we were on the second floor of the keeper's house about 11 o'clock at night, and there's a conversation going on. And one of the women said, "I heard something weird." Another one said, was it my camera?" And then you're going to hear me say something about, "I scratched my head. Is that what you heard?" Right about then, you're going to hear a really weird high-pitched voice. So let me play this.
What was that noise?
I heard it. My camera is closing.
No, it didn't come from your camera.
I scratched my head. You didn't hear that?
No, that's right. It was more
So
like a
I'm sure you could hear
high-pitched.
that. It almost sounds like a cat, but it wasn't. And it wasn't heard audibly at the time. It was only heard when it was played back. And it does sound like Mary, Mary. We don't know what it means, but I will say that there was a longtime keeper in the 1926 to 41. I think I'm remembering that right. Henry Cuskley, and he married the wife. He married the daughter of a previous keeper. The previous keeper, Leandra White, had died in the keeper's house. His wife had also died in the keeper's house. The daughter who married Henry Cuskley was named Mary. So some people think that's Mary's mother who had died in the keeper's house calling out for Mary. Can I prove that? Of course not, but it's an interesting speculation. So these pictures were taken during our first ever public nighttime event at the lighthouse. This is that's the entry to Fort Constitution, right next to the lighthouse. And that is looking from inside the fort out the entrance to the Coast Guard station. Late at night, nothing going on the Coast Guard station whatsoever, no cars moving around or anything else. And in both pictures here, this was taken by a woman who was right near me. I was pretty close to her when she took these pictures. She called me over. It was just a little point and shoot digital camera. She couldn't figure out how she got these pictures. It looks like a green mist sort of flying through that entryway. And one of these was shown in the Ghost Hunters show. Ghost Hunters did one of their shows at Portsmouth Harbor Light in 2008. Whoops, I should go back for a second. Just to explain, the thing on the right has to do with an explosion that happened there on the 4th of July in 1809. An accidental explosion. They were going to fire a salute with a cannon, and there was an accidental explosion. 8 people killed instantly. That's why you see 8 coffins on there, but 2 others died from their wounds. And a lot of people attribute strange happenings in the fort to that accident. So one more interesting picture here. This is from one of Sauhegan's Paranormal's investigation. The woman in the middle there said that she felt something was touching her neck. Seconds after she said that, somebody took this picture. And of course, that blob of light there was not seen by anybody at the time, but it was seen when they looked at the picture. And it kind of looks like something is coming out of that blob of light and touching the back of her head or her neck there. Now, some years ago, I showed this in front of an audience that included a paranormal investigator from England. He said, "Wait a minute, let me look at that." And he got up and he looked really closely and he said, "That's a moth." He said, "A moth flew in front of the picture, in front of the camera when this picture was taken." And my feeling was, well, yeah, well, maybe, but if that's the case, isn't that absolutely incredible that a moth happened to fly right in that position seconds after this woman said something was touching her neck? I mean, what are the chances of that, that the moth happened to be right there? So I'm not sure I agree with his assessment there. So just one more quick story I want to tell you. This is Connie Small again. As I mentioned, she was the wife of the last keeper at Portsmouth Harbor Light. She died at 103 in early 2005. And then 6 months later, we had New England Ghost Project do the first ever investigation there. So about 12:30 a.m., we were in the keeper's house, and there's a pretty big group of people, about eight or something like that. I think it was eight people. We went upstairs into a little kitchen area, and Maureen Wood, the psychic medium, we were all standing, and she said, "Oh, there's somebody here." And then she went into what appeared to be one of her trances, and she said, first she said, "There's somebody here, but it's not very strong." Then she said, "Oh, there's somebody else here." And she started speaking as if she was an old woman. And she said, "I want to thank you." And Ron was standing next to her and he said, "Oh, is it me you want to thank?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, be that way. Is it Jeremy?" And she said, "Yes, I want to thank you for the gift," she said, again in a kind of a halting old woman's voice. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, it sounds like Connie talking, but I thought, no, it's not. It's Maureen. And I thought that's crazy to think that it's Connie. But the way she was speaking sounded like Connie. And again, Maureen didn't know anything about the place coming in. She had never heard of any of us or knew nothing about the lighthouse or Connie or anything else. So she didn't say much more. She said, "I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the gift." And I had given her gifts, including the certificate she's holding here as honorary chairperson. So after just a minute or so of doing that, Maureen fell to the floor. She almost always does that when she does this channeling thing. She'll fall to the floor because Ron's theory is that like there's a moment there when like nobody's in charge, like the spirit leaves and Maureen isn't really back yet. I don't know if that's true exactly, but I've seen it happen a number of times. So she went boom on the floor. She was okay, and after a few minutes, she kind of came out of it, and they helped her downstairs. I stayed upstairs a little bit longer, and then one of our volunteers, Roxy, came upstairs, and Roxy was kind of shaken up, and she said, "You won't believe what Maureen just said to me." Now, to go back to Connie's funeral 6 months earlier, Roxy and her husband were there. I was one of the last ones to leave the church, but Roxy and her husband are the last ones to leave the church. So I didn't see this, but Roxy told me that they went up to the open casket in front of the church. Roxy had a bouquet of pink tulips. The minister said, "If you want to put those flowers in the coffin, go ahead." She did. And so pink tulips in the coffin. 6 months later, Maureen out of the blue said to Roxy, "Connie wants to thank you for the big pink flowers." So that was pretty interesting. And then a little while later, Maureen said to me and Roxy together, "Connie wants to thank you for being at her funeral." And I've never heard that before or since from anybody. So it was an interesting night to say the least. I still remain an open-minded skeptic. I try not to jump to any easy conclusions about any of this. I'm not trying to change anybody's minds about any of it. But I think there's something interesting going on. You can decide for yourself what is going on exactly. But I know for a fact I think there's things in this universe we don't understand at this point. So with that, I just want to mention the podcast I do for the U.S. Lighthouse Society called Lighthearted, as in people who have lighthouses in their hearts. This Sunday, I'm posting my 300th episode. It started in 2019. I'm doing a special episode for the 300th, and then I'm going to go to every other week instead of every week, which I've done ever since I started. So I have so much fun interviewing people connected to lighthouses all over the world, ex-keepers and authors and so forth. I just enjoy it so much. And here's some sources of information, my own website, newenglandlighthouses.net. If you want to read more about lighthouse preservation, check out American Lighthouse Foundation or U.S. Lighthouse Society. And our local chapter here in the Portsmouth area, a chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation, Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. And if you want to read more about New England Ghost Project, and they have special events too, check out newenglandghostproject.com. So, hope I haven't talked too long here. I see it's 8:10, so I'm going to come out of screen sharing here.
Thank you,
And
Jeremy. That's
you're
really
very
great.
welcome.
That was wonderful. Fascinating, fascinating. Seriously, all these stories. You have so many stories. This is really
I
great.
do, believe me, that just scratches the surface. So I'm always relieved when I do this to see if there's anybody still in the room. So because I can't see anybody while I'm doing the presentation. So thank
All
you
right,
all for
here
your
we go. Can you see everyone now?
well, no, but I can see the participant. I'm only seeing myself on the screen still, but
Oh, okay,
I'm
so
seeing you
just
in a little box, but
yeah, so
um
just go to the
that can go to
gallery
gallery view. Yeah,
gallery
exactly.
view.
There we go. Yeah,
Yeah.
some reason it changed to speaker view. So
Now,
now I see you.
everyone
Yeah.
was very quiet. They didn't send any questions, and I'm wondering if anyone has any
Really?
questions. I have one question,
Either
and
I put
that
them to sleep or I explained everything there is to know about Lighthouse Ghost Stories. I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
think it's pretty fascinating. I really do. I mean, there's so many lighthouses too. But my question is, the wife of the pirate, he just stranded her on that island and never went back?
I wouldn't put too much stock in that particular story. You know, a lot, like I said, there's some of these stories that fall under the heading of they say. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
There's no
yeah, yeah.
proof at all that Blackbeard the pirate was ever in this region at all, but it's a very well-known legend. There are versions of the story that'll say the first mate of Captain Kidd the pirate is the one who did that. So
Oh,
it depends on which version you read. So again, I
yeah,
wouldn't put a lot of stock into that, but
yeah.
it's,
That was
it's a well-known legend for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
tough marriage. Well, so let's see here. We have a message from Lynn saying, "Thank you for a fascinating presentation."
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Does anyone have any questions about any of these incredible, interesting stories? Uh, you know,
Or, general lighthouse questions, I'd be happy to try to answer as well if anybody has
you can always unmute yourself to ask something too, because you have the ability to do so. I'm going to see lighthouses differently now. I mean, it's going to be a little scary to go
Well,
there.
I've had, I heard that voice in Portsmouth Harbor Light, and I've been there a number of times at night with a lot of these groups doing investigations and stuff, and it feels a little sort of creepy sometimes, but
I bet.
I don't think of it in a negative way. I just think it's interesting. And, mostly these things aren't super scary or dangerous or anything except in the movies for the most part, as far as I can tell. But I have to say I've been there late at night when I'll say hello to the captain, or say good night to him and I'm locking up the door. So just in case he's listening.
So,
Um,
do you sleep over?
no,
No.
no. I've been there, the only times I've been there really late at night are when we've done some of these paranormal investigations.
And you're with
And
other people. You're with
with
other
other
people.
people, but
Yeah.
sometimes I've had to go back
To
with nobody else
safety.
anywhere near me in pitch darkness and shut the light off inside the lighthouse and lock the door with just maybe a little moonlight or starlight. It's almost
Oh,
completely dark, a flashlight to see things. And
yeah.
that's where it feels almost a little creepy when I'm there
And
totally
you
by
have
myself in the
lived
dark.
to tell the tale. Yeah.
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I have to tell you, one of the scariest lighthouses I ever saw was in Nova Scotia at is it Perkins Cove? Is that what it's called?
Peggy's Cove.
Peggy's Cove. Oh
Yep.
my God. It was so scary. It's
Really?
the huge,
Really?
well, yeah, because it was at night and it was lit up, and they have all these signs that say many people have died here. And you see
Oh,
the huge waves crashing
yeah.
up on the
People
rocks, and
get
my,
swept off the rocks. Yeah.
oh my God, it
I've
was
been
pretty.
there. It's a really cute, kind of small lighthouse. It's very photogenic. We have the Nubble light in Maine, here in York, Maine, that's very photogenic, photographed by hundreds of thousands of people a year. I think of Peggy's Cove kind of like their Nubble light in a way. But yeah, people go on, down on the rocks when they shouldn't, when the seas are rough and stuff, and people
Right.
have been swept away. Yeah.
Yes, and at the time there was a photographer down there on a rock taking, a film or taking pictures, whatever. And my husband's trying to get close and take these pictures. I was having a fit. But
Yeah.
it was so scary. So at night, and it was like kind of really misty. It was a
Hmm.
great Halloween night, although it was in the summer. But
You
it
just
was a
reminded
great.
me it was the first time. I think it was for that first time when New England Ghost Project was there in 2005. It was kind of a misty night, not like thick fog, but a little bit of fog, little sort of mist in the air. And we stayed there until about 2 a.m. and we were getting ready to leave. because it was kind of misty, it's a green light at night. And you know how you have, I guess you call it the astragals, the things between the panes of glass in the lantern
Mm-hmm.
that breaks up the light. It's a fixed light. It doesn't flash or anything, just a steady light.
Uh-huh.
But it was broken up into these rays, these green rays coming out into the mist all the way around, these spokes of light. And it was just absolutely gorgeous. I'll never
Beautiful.
forget that. It's the most beautiful I've ever seen that light. So being at lighthouses at night, aside from any of these stories, it's always special being at these lighthouses at night.
Yeah, well, I think you have a very cool job. I do.
I do. I still work full time as the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and I feel very lucky.
Oh yeah,
I really do.
it's a really cool thing. Really interesting, and I love the stories. And I'm going to check to see how many of your books we have in our collection. Also, I'm sure we have several.
Yeah.
And I also just want to tell you that our head of the Friends, Connie Spiros, with whom you had that
Hmm.
program 10 years ago, I texted her and she remembers you and she
Okay.
says hello. So yeah, I
I'll
wanted to
say hi to
let you know.
Connie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can
Okay.
remember. I think that's the only time I've been in your library, but I can actually remember it pretty well, which is saying a lot because I've done
A
hundreds
lot.
of lectures. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, it's a beautiful building. We had a wonderful renovation here, actually in 2009. So you were here, I
Okay.
think, in
Yeah, I remember it being
2010.
a beautiful, new-looking library. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lovely spot. So let's see. We had a couple things here in the chat. Let me just see what I can tell you. So Taylor says, "Thank you. That was very interesting, and I'm looking forward to listening to your podcast also."
Oh, thank you,
Yeah,
Taylor.
and Craig says, "Have you been to any lighthouses on the West Coast?"
I have. In 2015, I flew to San Diego and I rented a car, little Toyota Yaris, little tiny car, and I drove up the entire West Coast from San Diego to Seattle in a month by myself. And I
Ah,
photographed over 60 lighthouses. And I wrote a book called The Lighthouse Handbook West Coast. I also have a book called The Lighthouse Handbook New England. So,
oh,
yeah, so I saw almost
oh,
every lighthouse on the West Coast and then spent another week up in British Columbia.
oh.
There's, the light, as far as the lighthouse ghost stories go, yeah, I'm not sure I can think of any really quickly off the top of my head, but the West Coast lighthouses have them too. They're not exclusive to New England by any means.
Oh,
And there's some
interesting.
in it's funny. Occasionally I've heard something from like the UK, England or Scotland or places over there, lighthouse ghost stories, but not much. My feeling is they have castles. They have haunted castles, so they don't really need haunted
Yeah, they don't need
lighthouses.
them.
You know.
That's right. That's right. We were actually in Italy recently. We went to this really scary fortress castle
Hmm.
um, on this island off the coast of Naples, and it was so scary. And they had it was a prison for a while. Ah,
Uh-huh.
it was so scary. They have a lot of
Yeah.
very, oh. Yeah, well, this is very interesting. Thank you so much for this talk.
You're very welcome.
We
Thank
might
you.
have to have you come back and talk about some more lighthouse stories, perhaps ones that are not haunted.
Well,
Yeah.
I have a lot of those too. I have a lot of non-haunted stories.
Now, before you go, Jeremy, just tell me again, there are 55 lighthouses in Massachusetts. Is that right?
Yeah, again, it's hard to give exact numbers for any of that because people argue or debate what constitutes an official lighthouse or not. So, but by my count, there's 55 lighthouses in Massachusetts, 66 in Maine. But then, as I asked you before this started, I asked you what the one of the most lighthouses is. The state with the most lighthouses is Michigan.
I would never
Uh,
have guessed that. Yeah.
yeah, most
Yeah.
people don't, with about 120.
Because
Again,
I
there's
guessed Maine, didn't I? I guessed
you
Maine.
did. Well, most
Yeah.
people do. Most people do. But there's hundreds of lighthouses on the Great Lakes, and then the second one is New York with almost 80 something, depending on how you count them. So yeah,
And then Maine is third,
Maine is
right?
third. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, thanks again. Thank you very, very much for this talk. And thank you everyone for being here. And if you have any questions that you think of after the talk, just email me and I'll send them to Jeremy and get you an
Yeah.
answer.
I'm
Okay,
pretty easy to find too, and I hope maybe people might listen to the podcast and contact me with any questions or comments or whatever.
good. And I also put the website in the chat so people could see that. So,
Thank you.
and Leah says one last thing, which is yay.
Thank
Okay, so on that
you.
note, on that positive note, I'll say good night and I hope to see you next time. It was a pleasure.
Good
Bye,
night. Thank
everybody.
you.
Good night.